Throughout this course, we've talked about how we all have values and experiences that shape how we think about conservation. We've talked about the influence that these values have before and what we choose to prioritize. But these values and experiences also influence what we think is right and wrong. They influence our ethical perspectives and what we think are right and wrong actions in conservation. In this video, we will overview some of the dominant ethical frameworks that influence decision-making in conservation. First, we need to make the distinction between instrumental and intrinsic value, as these are two terms that will come up quite a bit in our discussions this week. Instrumental value is valuing something as a means to some end. Something has value because we get some benefit from it, or it helps us to achieve some goal. In the context of conservation, this usually means valuing nature or some particular species for what it does or gives to humans. For example, we may want to protect oyster beds because of how they filter water, or we may want to maintain their populations so that they can be harvested for human consumption. If you think back to our lecture on biocentric and anthropocentric approaches to conservation, instrumental value is often associated with more anthropocentric approaches. On the other hand, if something has intrinsic value, it has value in itself. It is valued for its own sake. In the context of conservation, this means that nature and non-human species in general have value in and of themselves, so they deserve to be protected simply so that they can continue to exist, even if they have no apparent value to humans. To go back to the example of protecting oyster beds, with intrinsic value, they are deemed to be of value simply because they exist. They are living creatures and they deserve to continue to persist. This would be true even if they did not provide filtering functions, or even if they were inedible or even poisonous to humans. Overall, intrinsic value is usually associated with more biocentric approaches to conservation. There are a multitude of different ethical perspectives that people hold within conservation, and they all consider the instrumental and intrinsic value of non-human species and nature more broadly in different ways. While the perspectives we are going to look at here today are not an exhaustive list, they are some of the more dominant perspectives that you will find within conservation. Here we will take a look at utilitarianism, environmental ethics, and the rights of nature movement. Utilitarianism is an ethical perspective that is focused on the results or consequences of our actions and aims to maximize the amount of good consequences of any set of actions. The goal of decision-making is to provide the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. With utilitarianism and conservation, the instrumental value of nature and non-human species dominates. Decisions are guided by what would benefit human society the most. This means that decisions are often made on the basis of ecosystem services, which are the benefits that people receive from nature, things like water filtration, pollination, and raw materials like lumber and food. The main argument is that humans need nature, so nature needs to be protected. And the goal often becomes to protect those areas that provide a lot of ecosystem services to a lot of people. For example, New York City has spent a lot of time, energy, and money working to protect the rivers and wetlands of the Croton, Catskill, and Delaware watersheds because that's where the city draws most of its fresh water from. These were pragmatic decisions because although the city has spent nearly $1 billion on land acquisition in order to ensure that critical areas remain protected, it has been estimated that this actually saved the city over $10 billion, which they would have had to spend on the construction of water filtration plants, plus the $100 million or so that it would cost to maintain these systems each year. On the other hand, environmental ethics is more focused on the intrinsic value of non-human species. As an ethical framework, it emerged in the 1970s as a way to challenge the moral superiority of humans over other species, and one of the main goals of the field was to show that non-human species have intrinsic value, just like humans do. This would then open the door to humans having a moral obligation to avoid harming other species, making conservation a moral obligation. Under environmental ethics, decision-making in conservation is guided by aiming to do the most good for the most species, even if that means sacrificing human interests. At the heart of this is intrinsic value. Non-humans matter simply because they exist, and they have the right to continue to do so, even if they provide no apparent value to people. The concepts associated with environmental ethics are also prevalent in many indigenous cosmologies, where nature is often seen as our relatives who are deserving of just as much respect as our human ones. For example, we have touched on the work of Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer before. She is a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and she speaks of how nature is full of gifts of which we are the caretaker. Similarly, in the Mi'kmaq tradition, all animals are seen as persons and are viewed as our siblings, just like the humans we are in close relationship with. These perspectives are in stark contrast to the more colonial and utilitarian perspectives that see nature as a resource to be exploited. To view non-human beings as persons in their own right is to respect their way of being, their intentions, their contributions to our shared communities, and ultimately their own right to be. The Rights of Nature movement draws on these concepts and advocates for legal systems around the world to see non-human beings as sovereign beings that have the right to persist. And the movement has grown quite a bit over the last couple of decades and has gotten some pretty big wins in recent years. In New Zealand, a former national park named Te Ura is now recognized as its own legal entity. As such, it has all the rights of a legal person and thus cannot be destroyed, violated, bought, or sold. And the indigenous peoples of the area, the Tūhoe, have been given the right to speak on behalf of Te Ura in court. Here in Canada, the Magpie River in Quebec was granted similar rights earlier this year. Overall, ethical perspectives help us to think about how we ought to act and help us to understand how we feel about certain practices. We cannot deny that there is an emotional aspect to conservation. This emotion is perfectly normal and it influences a lot of our decision making. This is particularly true when it comes to acting on something that we perceive as an injustice. This week we will be discussing a number of controversial practices and topics in conservation, so keep in mind these different ethical perspectives and how these issues might be viewed through each of them.